Just a quick programming note before we begin here. There is some bonus content associated with this episode. Not necessarily topical, but the conversation, the banter continued, and we thought it might be fun for you to listen to what goes on behind the scenes with Bert and me. If you'd like to listen to this, just become a supporter of us on Substack or on Patreon at any level. This episode of Trifles is brought to you by listeners like you who support us on Patreon and Substack. To learn more, go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, there were 3 gables, 5 orange pips, and a sign of 4, but there are hundreds of other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about how much money Holmes actually collected from the Duke of Holderness? Or why Watson constantly had to read the telegrams to him?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Bert Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 377, The Effect of Trades Upon the Body. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the minutiae of the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Wolder.
And Bert, good news. I am not trading you for a podcaster to be named later.
Oh, you really should. You could trade me for 2 Galloways and at least 1 district attorney and maybe somebody on Entertainment Tonight.
Well, because what we do here is so entertaining?
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, I've progressed over the years from being a mere Sherlockian enthusiast to being a noted oddity. And so because of my reputation for odd eccentricity and literary pursuits, I'm sure that I could, I could probably be compellingly traded for, 2 or 3 millennials.
Well, just so you know, it was your oddities that attracted me to inviting you to be a co-host in the first place. So there you go.
Well, I've written a trifling monograph about oddities. And in fact, I'm going to follow it up with another trifling monograph about evenses, too.
Oh, well, there you go.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned monographs because those, or at least one of them, is going to come into play in this particular episode. This is the 3rd episode of the month, which means it's one of those times when we look at Sherlockian scholarship. And in this case, we go all the way back to the Baker Street Journal, Volume 3, Number 1 from the new series in 1953. An article by Remen Shank called The Effect of Trades Upon the Body. And we'll get into that in just a moment. Just wanted to remind you that as a supporter of the show, you are eligible for a monthly drawing at the end of every month. We put everyone's name into a revolving bin and select names at random, and each month one of our lucky supporters gets a free back issue of the Baker Street Journal. How do you become a supporter? Well, you can just go to Patreon or to Substack and support us at any level there. And we have links in the show notes for that. And we do appreciate every bit of support that our listeners give us. So thank you very much. Okay, the effect of trades upon the body. Are we talking like NFL trades, National Football League, or hockey, basketball? What is it?
we're talking about occupations. And this is another beautifully written and really interesting bit of old scholarship that can be found. Did we mention this can be found in the Baker Street Journal, Volume 3, Number 1, and it's also been reprinted in the Grand Game, Volume 1.
We just can't get the Grand Game anymore, that's all.
Oh, that's true. And you can tell a lot about the writer just by the first sentence, a lovely first sentence, a departure point for this essay. It is at once a major attraction and a source of continued irritation that the saga should propound at least as many riddles as it professes to solve. And it's just a wonderful departure point. And he goes on and writes, some of the former, notably the list of unreported cases alluded to by both Holmes and Watson on various occasions, have been the subject of much commentary. Others have gone comparatively unremarked. Attention has been drawn to one by J. Finley Christ via the question raised in his article for the numismatists. So apparently Christ had this article in a numismatic magazine entitled Glittering Golden Guineas. And in that article he asks, what exactly is a weaver's tooth?
Now, see, I thought that was a typo in the original canon. I thought it was supposed to be a beaver's tooth. Because, well, beavers are known for using their teeth. And like Finley Christ, I didn't realize what a weaver was or why a weaver might need to use his teeth.
Oh. Well, I thought it had to do with folk singers and whistling.
Say, Sonny.
But then nobody remembers the Weavers anymore, I suppose, except me. I think Pete Seeger was in the Weavers.
Holmes places emphasis on, as Finley Christ says, upon the influence of a trade upon the form of the hand, and in some cases always in connection with the vocational identification of a particular individual. The compositor's left thumb is mentioned in conjunction with the weaver's tooth. The hands of slaters, cork cutters, diamond polishers. Now this comes from Holmes's own exposition in The Sign of Four. He was talking with Watson early on in that case about some of his monographs, famously the first one he mentioned, upon the distinction between the ashes of various tobaccos. But then he said, here's my monograph upon the tracing of footsteps, with some remarks upon the uses of plaster of Paris as a preserver. Here, too, is a curious little work upon the influence of a trade upon the form of hand, with lithotypes of the hands of slaters, sailors, cork cutters, compositors, weavers, and diamond polishers. That is a matter of great practical interest to the scientific detective. So there you go.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And this, of course, is a departure point for Remen Shank, because that's where we're taking the rest of this paper. He says a search of the medical and dental literature reveals the odd fact that whereas the lesion identified by Holmes as a weaver's tooth is well known, it is nowhere referred to by that name. The best description he's been able to find is given by Burkitt in a book called Oral Medicine. On page 573, he says, tailors, quote, tailors and seamstresses who are in the habit of cutting their thread with their teeth may show a characteristic tooth defect, which consists of a sharp V-shaped notch in the middle of the incisal edge of the incisors. And this notching is most prominent in the upper incisors, and the tooth defect develops at times first on one pair of incisors, and when it's no longer possible to cut the thread because of the loss of tooth structure, then the teeth on the opposite side of the jaw are utilized. And there's a photograph that Remen Shank points to in this treatise. and then quotes oral pathology about this condition, which is seen especially in tailors and seamstresses and in textile workers. And it's disappointing that no more specific connection with the weaver than this textile worker reference can be traced. But this is no doubt due to the mechanization of the industry and the practical disappearance of weaving as a trade.
Interesting. It goes on to say that weavers are or were heir to more ills than just notched teeth. A term which still persists in modern medical vocabularies is weaver's bottom, which is chronic ischial bursitis due to the long continued pressure in sedentary occupation. It's probably something a number of white-collar workers suffer from today as well, I would imagine.
Well, it's lovely because he says, this is defined in the New Gould Medical Dictionary and translated into non-medical language. This, of course, means a pain in the fundament.
Oh, that's my nickname for you.
Oh, well, that's unkind.
I'm kidding.
But, isn't that grand?
Yeah.
Due to long continued pressure in a sedentary occupation. Boy, have we had pressure in sedentary occupations. Woo.
Well, and that is something that is obviously or maybe more widespread today. But back then, you think about the trades. Most trades required some activity, some form of being up and down, walking, visiting premises, etc. The weaver, well, you sat your butt down and you wove in one place.
Well, and Remen Shank finds, as he goes on here, he finds a book by Francesco Bonchesi, Dr. Francesco Bonchesi, entitled Occupational Marks. This is published in 1948 by Grun and Stratton, and it's just amazing. His digging about in this area. He says, had only Watson's admiration for his colleagues' methods been sufficient to inspire closer observation of his own patients, thus greatly extending the scope of the study and permitting a collaboration, there might have been an advance in forensic medicine. Watson missed a golden opportunity. In fact, another 50 years had to pass before Holmes's gift for observation and Watson's medical knowledge were combined in one man, finally to allow the compilation of this overdue volume, Occupational Marks by Dr. Francesco Bonchesi. Or Ronchesi, right.
And our friend Remen Shank, which I'm just going to call him Remy from now on. It's easier than saying his full name. Remy says that except for Holmes's own monograph, Dr. Ronchesi's appears to be the only work of this type and of these dimensions on record. It's the only one in print, he says, or even obtainable. But he covered it quite thoroughly and included not merely manual stigmata, but those of all parts of the body. Information to be found here is on most of the lesions mentioned, but not described by Holmes, though, as in the case of the weaver's tooth, they are not defined by those same words. And occupational marks affords only the barest mention to the tooth, and that is in terms of the seamstress, not the weaver. And
yes,
he says, and interestingly, he says, yeah, the bottom tends to get more attention. Well, yeah. I mean, this is a fine Italian man. Of course, he's paying more attention to the seamstress's bottom than her teeth.
Well, in thin individuals, apparently, this secondary effect in the form of a dermatitis produced by pressure between the seat and the bones of the pelvis. Well, the author of this book, Occupational Marks, suggests that Shakespeare's choice of bottom as the name of the weaver in A Midsummer Night's Dream was not a random one. He says, well, that suggestion is quite convincing. So the weaver was named Bottom in Midsummer Night's Dream. Not a coincidence. But then, of course, we're off to the slater's hand. And there's no precise description of that because presumably slate chipping has nearly vanished as a trade with the advent of manufactured roofing materials. Now, that's what a slater did. In the old days, you would have slate, and the idea was you'd have a skill at being able essentially to generate slices of slate that could be then used for roofing. And so the marks, however, he's speculating here, Remen Shank, probably included the fingertips of the left hand worn smooth by handling the stone, because we see that also in masons and bricklayers, and calluses across the right palm from gripping the hammer. It's also reasonable that callosities of the knees would be prominent, since roofing is done chiefly in a kneeling position. How about that? How about that for an analysis? That's very Holmesian.
Right. And it would be appropriate if Sherlock Holmes showed up in Bermuda to see slaters, but otherwise can't see him actually seeing knee calluses on a client.
Oh, well, that's true. But he would see wearing of the knees. Well, he looked at Vincent Spaulding's knees in
the knees of his trousers, at least.
Yes. Yeah, there you go.
So you could see the marks and as you say, the wearing through.
In the Red-Headed League, yeah.
Yeah. But he goes on to say, in selecting the hands of sailors as an illustration of his point, Holmes made an unfortunate choice. A sailor's hands aren't necessarily distinguishable from a variety of other possibilities. Distinctive occupational mark arises from the perpetual repetition of the same act in the same way. And while a sailor's life is hard, it's extremely varied. So it would be at once apparent from a mariner's hands that he did hard manual labor with both hands instead of just with the right hand. But surely, writes Shank, a dozen trades to which this applies equally well.
Well, and then he goes on to talk about calluses around the inner surface of the fingers because you're hauling on ropes, and that connects you to an old-fashioned rope-controlled elevator. But again, this would not be peculiar to the sailor, even in the days before elevators. Holmes was probably unconsciously allowing for the assistance afforded by typical gait and mannerisms, a weather-beaten face and neck and so on, and you can make that kind of connection. And then the hand of the cork cutter, another phenomenon banished from the contemporary scene by modern machinery. You can imagine that the calluses were produced on the thumb and first two fingers of the left hand by grasping the cork, and similarly on the thumb and across the inside of all four fingers of the right by the handle of the knife. And that is similar to the calluses caused by using small tools. Jewelers use small tools. And this apparently in the Ronchesi book, Occupational Mark. I got to get a copy of this. This is also covered. It's doubtful anyone but Holmes has ever published a first-hand description, since the trade can never have been followed by a large fraction of the population, even in Spain and Portugal. And that's a lovely point. How many people, really were cork cutters, particularly in, available to observation by Sherlock Holmes in London or in England?
Yeah. Well, similarly, speaking of calluses, the compositor's left thumb is characterized by the formation of the callus on the tip, often with the abrasion of the skin lower down across the ball of the digit. And in setting type, which is what a compositor does, the stick is held in the left hand and the type is placed in it with the right. And that assumes right-handedness. But as each piece of type is dropped into the stick, the left thumb slides it into position against the previous the previous piece of type. and holds it snugly against the corner. So you're basically taking these individual letters, lining them up on this stick or this row, and holding it in place with your thumb as you go and retrieve the next letter. Obviously a very manual process at the time. And now, of course, we don't do this kind of, but even back in the 50s and earlier, linotype was used, which is more of an automated process and bulk printing. So the lesion in Shank's days is too uncommon to find a place in his then present literature. It's encountered only among job printers and small-town presses, and then not well developed. In the old days, pronounced cases were undoubtedly frequent and very likely accompanied by calluses of the fingers and palm from grasping the handle of the stick, and the abrasion of the tips from the thumb and the fingers of the right hand from picking up those sharp-faced types out of the box.
It's just worth pointing out, isn't this wonderful? The way this all developed. You've got this offhand reference to the weaver's tooth, but Remen Shank, what happens is he sees this reference and a vast gulf opens up, an empty sphere. No knowledge. We can't find out anything about the weaver's tooth. And look what he has, discovered, to fill it up, all just out of passion for Sherlock Holmes and of interest in filling in a previously unknown area. Well, and then to the earlier point about how did Holmes observe all of this there in London, with his particular location when we were talking about slate cutters and so on. Well, how did he see this among weavers? And Shank says, well, it's possible that he made personal investigation among the remoter villages of northern Britain or the Ozarks. And there are a wide variety of calluses peculiar to textile trades. There's more distinctive markings other than just weaver's tooths. And I love this because then he gives us this array of fabulous titles for positions and workers. He says, there is the different workers who are involved in this, the doffer, the quiller, the hooker, the mule spinner, and none of them could have been created by hand looming. It's highly likely the marks to which Holmes referred were calluses on the right hand from handling the shuttle, and perhaps on the left from the heddles. But just where these were placed and what was their appearance, only a weaver could say.
Well, I want to take issue with that, though, as he lists off those other roles. In my experience, and it is very limited, I'm just going to say that up front, I have never seen calluses on a hooker.
How about a doffer and a quiller? How about a mule spinner?
Do they don't work the same side of the street as the hookers?
Well, and then we're off to the diamond polisher. The hand of the diamond polisher will also have to remain undescribed. It's not so much this occupation's been mechanized or rendered obsolete as that the number who follow it has always been very small. Jewelry polishers have nails worn smooth and stained red by the rouge. Lens polishers show certain nails worn down from picking the glass from its pitch bed. And those who polish metal jewelry wear calluses from holding the metal parts against the wheel. And since diamonds are polished in a pitch bed on the end of a dopstick, I have no idea what all of this is. Any or all of the 3 marks described might appear in a lapidary doing much handwork. But just to describe them to the diamond polisher is to use the term in a generic sense, since the polishing of any gemstone would have the same effects.
Yeah, I had an uncle who used to work for Smith & Wesson, and he moved around the factory over the course of his career, but one of his jobs, I remember him telling us, was as a polisher. And during those years, he showed us his hands, he lost his fingerprints because of the repetitive polishing, the material he touched. Obviously, the safety equipment back in those days, back in the 70s and 80s, was a little less stringent than it is now, but that was very much an effect of being a polisher.
Boy, that is interesting. Oh, how about that? Well, that's a very interesting connection.
Yeah.
Well, as we're heading for the exits here, Remen Shank says, we have not touched upon Sherlock Holmes himself. There's at least one, he says, possibly two, signs upon Holmes himself of the sort under discussion. He was in the habit of taking hypodermic injections of some kind that would be clear from the sinewy forearm and wrist, all dotted and scarred, with innumerable puncture marks.
Now, you see, I take issue with that. I think Watson may have been jumping to conclusions in that area. It could very well have been that Holmes was merely visiting the allergist and was being tested. Those various puncture marks up and down the forearm.
Oh, right. Well, maybe he was an early innovator. I can't imagine. I don't know when allergen testing was codified, but I can't imagine. Maybe he invented it. That's true. He was probably. That's very good. Oh, boy, there's a paper there.
It could be.
Oh. Yeah, well, and then Shank says, the use of insulin had not yet made such a practice common. So, the natural conclusion would be drug addiction. And only cocaine, he says, causes a blue discoloration at the site of injection. And then the other mark of Holmes's habits, at least potentially capable of leaving some appearance, was violin playing, which may produce an irritation in the angle of the left jaw, where it grips the cheek piece. But then it's probably not visible on Sherlock Holmes because he did not play consistently, and when he did, he was as likely as not to use his lap instead of his shoulder.
Across his knees, right? And then Shank wraps it up with saying Watson himself may have sported a left hand identifying him as a member of the medical profession. And the sign isn't seen too often now, but it was formerly common for a doctor to develop a distinct callus or bony swelling of the back of the back of the distal phalanx of the left index finger as a result of using it as an anvil and percussing thoraxes and abdomens. Since Holmes never mentioned it, Watson was probably not thus afflicted. The absence of the mark is not self-contradictory, as some physicians place little or no reliance on auscultation as a diagnostic method. And let's face it, Watson wasn't really in active practice in many of those years, so it may have been superfluous anyway.
But isn't that interesting? Here, Remen Shank, and we know very little, nothing about him, has left in that observation perhaps an indication of his own specialty in practice, auscultation, because auscultation is the practice of listening through with the stethoscope as an example to the action of the heart and other organs. And what I gather from all of this is that it's perfectly likely that Remen Shank himself was a physician.
Well, no, he was director of research for the Keystone Chemical Corporation in Pennsylvania and taught chemistry for 7 years at NYU.
Oh, you found him. So he was a chemistry professor.
Yes.
Well, how interesting. I wonder why he didn't have any laboratory marks, from people who handle test tubes and Bunsen burners. And, my father was a chemist, and he had certain physical characteristics from his early work in the lab that I remember. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Oh, good for you. I had no idea.
Well, here it is, and it is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Pshaw, my dear fellow. What do the public, the great and observant public, who can hardly tell a weed of eye's tooth or a compositor by his left arm, care about the finer shades of analysis and deduction?